Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Walter Pasquarelli. I've spent the last 10-ish years or so working in the field of AI infrastructure investments. I advise mostly ministers around AI readiness and how they can prepare the countries around improving their ecosystems. When we think about European technological sovereignty, the first faces that come up are usually these kinds of guys. We think of copper, we think of chips, we think of the newest models, we think of running the fastest new GPT, the thing that can make us better and faster than every other nation and make us independent on that. And typically, when I advise country leaders or any other investment firms or other stakeholders, the number one thing that comes up when it comes to European technological sovereignty is a picture that looks something like this. We want to develop the biggest models, the best European Claude or the new GPT. Then we need to build the computing centers, the data centers to power those. Then, of course, we want to build the chips. We need to have the energy. We need to have the minerals. And obviously, we need to have the talent at the bottom of the stack that runs through all of this. And Europe's picture in this conversation is somewhat behind. If we look at the infrastructure investments around compute that are happening in Europe, about 70% belong to American firms. European cloud providers at the market share is roughly at about 15%. So there has been enormous conversations over the past years with a changing geopolitical landscape to say Europe needs to become more independent from the US. But the one thing that I was really interested in, I wanted to offer you perhaps a slightly different perspective on that, is by looking at the downstream effects. What happens to users, to workers, to society if sovereignty is not met? What is the real risk and the opportunity that arises from that? This is what we call cognitive sovereignty, which we believe within the AI policy circles that this will be the direct effect and impact that will have a shape on how we should frame the conversation around sovereignty. Now, the conversation starts at an evening in Cambridge after a dinner at one of the colleges where I was holding a lecture. And then that day, I was hearing a group of freshers girls, so people that had just entered university, talking about someone named Dan. One of them used to say, Dan is this fantastic guy. Dan is someone that I can always ask for advice. Dan has a bit of an attitude, but he is endearing. And so my main thought at that point was, wow, Dan, someone's got it going on. Didn't think about it too much any further. But just a few nights later, during a late night TikTok scroll, I saw someone else gushing about this guy called Dan. The video had 100,000 likes, numerous comments, and people were commenting, resharing it. And when I heard the response, when the person spoke into her phone, the answer hit me. Dan was not some handsome bloke or a celebrity that I had imagined. In fact, Dan wasn't even a human at all. Dan was ChatGPT's male voice. Thousands of people, predominantly young teenagers, had started talking about this person named Dan and were building what we understood as being so-called reactions, emotional reactions, relationships with this chatbot, which sounded a bit like a scene from some kind of weird sci-fi movie. But just a few days later, the Daily Mail reported that a German Bundesliga player had slid into the DMs of an influencer called Emily Pellegrini and asked her out for coffee. Surprise, surprise, and I think you probably know the answer right now. Emily Pellegrini was also not a human being. In fact, Emily Pellegrini was an AI-generated influencer that was part of a modeling family that was raking in about $90,000 on platforms like OnlyFans. Now, all of these examples would sound like edge cases, strange things that we think, where should even be a political dimension to all of this? These are just some weird people that fall in love with AI if we want. But over time, we found that the more we spoke to people, and I'm talking tens of thousands, predominantly Gen Z, predominantly teenagers, we see that to them, nobody really thinks, nobody really believes that these are real people. Nobody really believes that chatbots are actually humans in the flesh and blood. What matters is the experience to consider what's authentic, if it gets the job done. And this is what we call the new theory of synthetic reality. Now, what does it mean on a political and economic basis if AI changes our understanding of authenticity? What does this mean, especially when it comes to questions related to this technological sovereignty of the European continent and European countries? In economic terms, it looks something like this. We did run a survey just a couple of months ago with about 1,500 adults across the UK and the US. The results are coming in as well for some European countries, and they look surprisingly similar. And what we find is that increasingly people use AI companions for regular company. About 4.1% across the general population, across about 8% among younger generations. 8% report that they rely on these chatbots emotionally for their own mental health. So that's 1 in 12. But critically, the most interesting thing is when we look at the economic applications. And bear in mind, just yesterday I was in Switzerland and I was speaking to the CEO of one of the large investment firms. And he kept complaining to me that his analysts keep making investment recommendations based on advice from chatbots. That is widespread. The one thing that we were interested in is understanding if we have competing expertise between a human and an AI chatbot, what do people decide? When it comes to health advice, when it comes to career decisions, when it comes to financial advice, when it comes to decide whether they want to date someone or not, about 1/3 prefers the advice from a chatbot as opposed to their therapist, their friend, their financial advisor, or their lawyer. And that has an impact on the way that we think, on our cognitive abilities, on our very own human intelligence, because we find that frequent AI tools used irresponsibly correlate significantly and negatively with our critical thinking abilities. Cognitive offloading, giving away our thinking, is the mechanism here, and the mechanism appears to be strongest in people who are young. This is roughly how the industry has been growing. Now, why does this matter for the context of European technological sovereignty? Why am I talking about these young people? And bear in mind, this is not just young folks, this is people also in my age. This is even rising higher for people who are retired, people who are past the age of 65, who experience loneliness. Why would this matter within a European context? Now, remember back the stack and the clouds that we discussed earlier. The application of artificial intelligence in work environments and economic professions, be it, for instance, for doctors, for lawyers, for therapists, for any kind of white-collar worker, is becoming a lot more standardized than we believe. There have been all these surveys done. There have been several measurements being conducted, but really, the majority of people, from what we know today, don't report it. That's what we call shadow AI, because they don't want their managers to know, because there's embarrassment around it, because the older generations don't fully understand how they use it, is what they report. The problem, the question that we need to answer here is that the majority of the foundation models, the GPTs, the Claudes, the Geminis, they encode worldviews which are fundamentally skewed by American values, American understandings, American reasonings. And perhaps what is even more important, that if we think that artificial intelligence will to some extent run large sections of our economy, that makes it also much more expensive for us to use. Simply because the outputs that we get from AI models, they have to be translated. They're trained on English-speaking data. If I am a lawyer, if I'm a politician in Poland, in France, or in Germany, and I want to translate this, that requires additional token. Additional tokens mean we need additional computing power. Additional computing power, the costs of our own economic productivity tend to rise as well. So what does this mean for the European policy landscape? What does this mean for us to maintain our cognitive sovereignty? The whole issue here is that this reminds us on some level a lot like 2010. So we made GDPR, and we thought, well, this is all about the data, and we need to keep that data in. Right reasoning, but possibly not adapted for the year 2026 and beyond. Generally speaking, data sovereignty without cognitive sovereignty is a little bit like owning a library, and we're all happy about that. Oh, I'm a library owner, I like books, but someone else writes the books, and I don't have control over what's written in the books, and I show the books to all of my children, and I show the books to everyone that I work for without being the author of those books myself. So what we are facing right now is that we're regulating the outputs of artificial intelligence before actually securing the substrate of cognition. And if we outsource our thinking to artificial intelligence, that's not all negative, I should say. That means that the inputs that we get is something that as Europeans, we should have a control, we should have an influence over that. So what should Europe do? The number one thing is that we want to choose the layer of sovereignty which is achievable. One area that could be very positive for us is, for example, on the model alignments. So we want to make sure that we become the masters in ensuring that the models that we use, that we deploy for the young generations, remain actually safe. The other point where we are far behind is on AI literacy. And AI literacy is essentially the education. If I am a 16-year-old or a 12-year-old or a university student, how am I meant to use these kinds of models that we maintain our own original thinking? There's almost no program at the national and not the, I was about to say federal level, let's say at the pan-European level, that actually produces meaningful programs at scale that allows us to fully understand how we keep the European thinking within our own borders and keep it original. Other thinking has been around procurements. Moving faster is another one of these slogans that I think needs to be operationalized, and I'm not quite sure how useful that is. But potentially the one most important thing is when we think about the sovereignty is that we want to maintain our own cultural categories and cultural characteristic within our own models. If the models are produced elsewhere, that means that our linguistic traits, linguistic abilities, the small details that ultimately define and characterize the diversity of the European ecosystems get deprioritized. How do we ensure that? That is something that we still need to integrate in European policy. Now, the number one thing that I think is, I want to give you as a final message, the future is fundamentally synthetic. The way that we get advice is synthetic. The way that younger generations are getting used to operating, to working, to collaborating with artificial intelligence, whether we realize it or not, has already happened. The question is how we distinguish the European continent and the European countries and create sufficient sovereignty and independence to maintain our own cultural goods and our own distinct competitive advantages in an economy which will be increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence. Here are some survey results from the study that I just shared earlier, if that is of any interest to you. Other than that, I would like to thank you very much. I look forward to further discussions today. Thank you.